Hi, everybody. My name is Mako Nagasawa. I'm the director of the Anástasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry. I'm also the author of the book that you kind of see in the background of this graphic in the title slide, Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics in the United States. It was published by Wipf and Stock Publishers in January of 2021. We are now recording this in July of 2022 because of the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. And there's a little bit more to discuss. And so this slide is called In the Post-Roe United States. We also wanted to make the book and the material in the book a little more accessible. So you do not have to have read the book in order to really engage this material. But there is a study guide for abortion policy, study and action guide for abortion policy on our website, which I'll point to later. And we broke this down into 3 sessions. So this is session 1, and it is called Scripture and Science. I'll give a little more background to what we're doing here. The objectives for this 3-session class or presentation series. Number 1, trace what Jewish and Christian leaders have said about the fetus and abortion. And I almost guarantee that you will be surprised at the material here to look at the history and why there has been the debate and discussion and uncertainty. Number 2, to identify mistakes that Christians have made and today and aim to correct them. So that relates to that. This is going to relate to issues of contraception or economics, like the relationship between poverty and the abortion rate, and so on. And third, we're going to discern how abortion as an issue is used for other political purposes, like to support criminalization or capitalism. There's some really disturbing issues that make that union of issues counterproductive on its face. In other words, the current version of the anti-abortion movement actually increases the abortion rate, doesn't decrease it. So here's a little bit more information just about the organization and myself, and ways that you can engage, especially if you are watching this video on our YouTube channel, for instance. Our main website is anastasiscenter.org, and our focus primarily is to explore early Christian restorative justice and healing atonement, the idea that Jesus came to acquire a fallen humanity and heal it in himself to give it back to us. And all of this is grounds for thinking relationally about issues of justice and harm. The issue of abortion is really challenging. And so there's a page dedicated to that. There's also a study and action guide for abortion policy, as I mentioned. You can find more information about our organization on our YouTube channel, in our video classes and messages that we put up there. If you would like to engage with this topic, you can do so in the YouTube comments, but also you could be part of our Facebook group, Healing Atonement and Restorative Justice. Please just look that up and request to be joined, and our administrators will do that. And you can be part of a community that is wrestling with these things and discussing them. Our social media platforms are the typical ones: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, as well as my personal social media platforms. There's also an author page, Mako A. Nagasawa, which is dedicated to discussion of the book in particular. And then there's the regular stuff. So let's jump into the session where we talk about Scripture and science. I'm going to talk about Scripture for 30 minutes and science for 10 minutes and break that up with discussion. I will be only recording my portion of the presentation and not the discussion portion, just so folks can feel like they can be more candid. And also, if you are using this material in another setting, you can obviously hit pause and take the discussion questions and that period of time for your own purposes. All right, so let's jump into Scripture. When do life and personhood begin? I've said elsewhere, and I say here, that I think it's important to consider religious and tradition-specific paradigms, how How do Buddhists answer that question? How do Christians, how do Jews, how do Muslims, and so on? And especially when it comes to the rights of the fetus and the principle of bodily autonomy. I ask folks to read a blog post that I wrote about these two principles. It would take you 5 or 10 minutes beforehand to read them. I asked folks to read that post before coming into this session. And I think that just gives you an appreciation for how complex this issue is. Now, many Christians think Scripture says conception establishes legal personhood, that the fetus is a full person at conception, not just human, like, okay, the fetus has human DNA, but should be given full personhood. For example, the Personhood Initiative is an organization that is Christian, that is lobbying for inserting fetal personhood laws into state constitutions. And they want to make it a felony crime to perform an abortion. Is that the only way to frame the issue, even in Scripture, though? So when we look at Scripture, we need to ask a whole bunch of questions that relate to abortion and relate to the fetus, like how do we organize and prioritize different bodily claims? How do we discern possibilities and limits for abortion? And how do we assess damage? How do we assess harm and address the harm that's done? So right away, let's jump into Scripture. Now, which Scripture is most important here? Well, by far and away, Exodus 21, verses 22 to 25 is the single most important passage on this topic, because it actually addresses the situation where there's harm done to the unborn fetus. Now, a lot of Christians go to other passages like Psalm 139 or Jeremiah 1, which are poetic passages where the writer says, God knew me in my mother's womb. Well, okay, sure, but that doesn't give us enough information. Like, at what point of fetal development was that? Does that matter? And besides, the passage Exodus 21 deals with what happens when the unborn fetus is harmed. So we have to start there. Now, I want to also acknowledge a caveat, which is the Christian use of Jewish law. It's complicated. There's a big discussion about, well, how can Christians read the Old Testament, in particular, what we call the law of Moses or the laws of the Sinai covenant? Because Christians are not the same as the people of Israel prior to Jesus. So we are going to look at this passage, though, and try to understand it on its own terms. That doesn't necessarily mean that once we do so, we're just going to apply it right away. What does this passage mean? Well, surprisingly, it actually depends on which translation of the Bible you read. So here is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. The translators here believe the passage is referring to someone causing a miscarriage by striking a pregnant woman, and then the assailant gets a fine. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there's a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, like to the mother, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, and so on. This translation is based on the Hebrew text called the Masoretic text. It's the text that the Jewish scholars in the 8th or 9th centuries used and standardized the Hebrew Bible around. This translation indicates that it's a situation of forced miscarriage. And it does not carry the life for life, eye for eye consequence, which means that the fetus is not assigned full legal personhood. The fetus is important, but because the life for life, eye for eye does not relate to the fetus, it is not treated as a full human person. Then there is the Greek Septuagint, which says something slightly different. The Greek Septuagint is named for the 70 scholars, Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, who translated the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Bible into Greek in this case, maybe 250 BC. This effort was done because Jewish folks in the diaspora community did not all speak Hebrew. Like the scholars, definitely the rabbis spoke Hebrew, read Hebrew, But the lay person, the average person, they spoke Greek, the common language. And so the leadership of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, commissioned or at least approved the Septuagint translation. By the way, this is the translation or the version of the Old Testament that is quoted most often in the New Testament. So this translation reads the Exodus 21 saying, yes, it's about a miscarriage, but then you observe the miscarriage and determine what stage of development was the fetus in. And if two men strive and smite a woman with child, and her child be born imperfectly formed, that is early in its development, and unformed or imperfectly formed, he shall be forced to pay a penalty, as the woman's husband may lay upon him. He shall pay with a valuation. But if it be perfectly formed, he shall give life for life, eye for eye, and so on. And so you could say that the Greek Septuagint is a little bit more ethically discerning about the fetus, because the folks are supposed to observe the miscarriage. Is the fetus imperfectly formed, or is it perfectly formed? Did it look human? And if it looks human, then you treat it with full human personhood. But if not, then it's a fine. Then there's another variation on this. Here, for example, is the ESV, the English Standard Version, which reads this situation as the pregnant woman is struck and she gives birth early, and the fetus is healthy, but then there could be more complications, in which case you impose consequences then. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined. Meaning just causing an early delivery results in a fine, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm to either the fetus or the woman, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. Now, the ESV and some other translations, by the way, these are representative translations, but this is also based on the Hebrew Masoretic text. And it's important because the translation really changes the meaning, doesn't it? This translation is commonly referenced by Christians who want to ban all abortions. And so it raises the question for us. When we think about abortion policy, should we adopt a strict anti-abortion position based on, let's say, the ESV or translations like it? So let's back up just a minute. Is the unborn fetus a fully human person? What does Scripture say? Well, it says no, maybe, and yes, which is unbelievable that there's this level of variation in what we have in terms of English translations, right? So the no would be the the NRSV, the maybe would be the Septuagint, where you say, okay, what stage of the fetus was it? And the yes, meaning just an early delivery, it results in a fine. If there's more harm, then you have more consequences. And by the way, John Calvin was the first Protestant to believe in the early delivery view, and John Piper is a more recent advocate of that. I'm going to argue that the early delivery view is wrong, and I know that is a serious claim, and I'm going to explain 9 reasons for why that is. Why do I go into such depth? Because it's important to debate Christians who use the ESV or other translations like it for a hardline anti-abortion position. How would you do that? You need to understand the issues. And so let's go deeper. So reason number 1 is because in the ancient Near East, the situation of a pregnant woman getting struck and miscarrying a fetus is a stock situation. And so it becomes stock case law in different ancient Near Eastern law codes. So the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi was a rough contemporary of Jewish law, the law of Moses. It was a few centuries before, but it has this same situation. If an awilu, which is an upper caste or upper class person, strikes a woman of the awilu class and thereby causes her to miscarry her fetus, he shall weigh and deliver 10 shekels of silver for her fetus. If that woman should die, they shall kill his daughter, the assailant's daughter. So at least in principle, scholars debate whether this was actually carried out or whether this is a statement of value or some kind of representation of punishment. But in any case, they shall kill his daughter, meaning that like the women were considered the property of the father. And if he should cause a woman of the commoner class to miscarry her fetus by the beating, he shall weigh and deliver 5 shekels of silver. If that woman should die, he shall weigh and deliver 30 shekels of silver. If he strikes an awilu's slave woman and thereby causes her to miscarry her fetus, he shall weigh and deliver 2 shekels of silver. That's really important. It's important to recognize, again, this is a stock situation, and what are we to learn as we compare it with Jewish law? Well, in Babylon, in the Code of Hammurabi, the punishment is based on the victim's class status, and the punishment for harming a mother depends on the mother's class. That is not true in Jewish law. In Jewish law, punishment is not based on the victim's class status. It's for harming a mother. The punishment for harming a mother is proportional to the harm done to the mother. In Babylon, the wife or the daughter are treated as property of the father, and the fines for the fetus are based on the fetus's class status. But in Jewish law, all persons are treated as children and property of God, not the property of the father. And the fines for the fetus are based on the circumstances, such as probably the stage of the pregnancy, how obvious was it that the woman was pregnant, or what was the intention of the assailant, how obvious is that? And that would include the stage of the fetus, at least in the Greek Septuagint. And in the Babylonian Code, the fines are determined by Hammurabi. In the Jewish law, fines are determined by a community process, ultimately approved by the men and women who are judges, the highest local authorities. And men and women were both judges. For example, in Judges 4, Deborah was a woman who was a judge and a prophetess, and that's evidence that in Israel, men and women were judges. That's kind of important, and it comes up later in session 3. I'll return to this. So those are some differences. They are important by itself, but there is also a similarity, which is the assailant's motive could have been to cause the abortion. Now, that's one reason. Now, I'll come back to the assailant's motive here. Reason number 2 for why the forced miscarriage view is correct and the early delivery view is not is that for full persons, Jewish law takes very seriously the difference between murder and manslaughter, and the difference is the intention of the assailant. So why does that not happen here? Let's draw out the logic tree, which is what you see here on the slide. On the left, if the fetus has personhood, like full human personhood, then you ask, okay, was the miscarriage accidental? It could have been if the assailant was exercising self-defense. So why would we think that? Well, it's possible, not necessary, but it's possible. In Deuteronomy 25, verses 11 and 12, for instance, there is the situation where a woman is part of the fight and is trying to harm another guy. So if the guy is striking her out of self-defense, then the miscarriage could be accidental. And then the process for that would follow the city of refuge process for unintentional manslaughter. But backing up on the logic tree, if the miscarriage was intentional, like the assailant wanted to cause it, then the process would be for murder. The fact that this question does not appear in the case law is really significant. It indicates that the starting premise is wrong. The fetus does not have full human personhood. What does happen here? Well, the case law focuses on the outcome. It is not primarily addressing the assailant's intention, but although that was probably discernible by the community, the judges, the local authorities of the community are involved, and it's probably accounted for by the fine. For instance, how obvious was the woman's pregnancy relates to how pregnant was she. The intention might have been, again, to cause the miscarriage. We see that motivation, or at least a motivation that would result in that, in other places in Scripture itself. So we can't rule that out. For example, the jealous husband might be thinking, my wife is pregnant with another man's child. And that motivation is addressed in Numbers 5. Or a rival male relative who's greedy for the inheritance might not want the woman to have a child. Let's say if the child had an uncle who would get more inheritance from grandpa, because if the woman, for example, has been recently widowed. We see that motivation in Genesis 38 or in Ruth 4. So again, we can't rule that out. And in this case, Exodus 21 treats the fetus as harm to the woman's body. And that's why this distinction between manslaughter versus murder is not really brought up as a possibility. The reason number 3 for the forced miscarriage view is the paper trail. So what's the history of Jewish discussion about this passage, Exodus 21? Well, either we have like discussion about fines until the fetus was formed, and that starts with the Greek Septuagint. Philo of Alexandria is the leading commentator, earliest commentator. He uses the Septuagint and definitely understands this as someone causes a miscarriage. And then there's some other rabbinical or Talmudic writings supporting that. Or at the same time, other writers address the situation of a forced miscarriage based on the Hebrew text, using full personhood starting at birth and breath, but not before that. Who uses that? Well, first of all, the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Dead Sea Scrolls have the same Hebrew text. And there's Aramaic accompaniments to the Hebrew scriptures. Targum Onkelos and Targum Yerushalmi, also called Pseudo-Jonathan, were Aramaic translations or accompaniments that were used by Aramaic-speaking Jews, similar to Greek-speaking Jews, right? These are folks in the diaspora who did not speak Hebrew or had trouble with it, and so they needed to create authoritative Aramaic translations. And Onkelos was used in Babylon. The Babylonian Jews had been taken into captivity back in 586 by the Babylonian Empire. And that content, according to Jewish tradition, went back to Ezra in 440 BC. Targum Onkelos was finally written down between 100 to 150 AD, so early 2nd century, but the content went back centuries. There was also dialogue between the Babylonian Jews and the Palestinian Jews. There was a lot of rich communication that resulted in the Talmud being codified. And the Targum Yerushalmi was another Aramaic translation that was finally written down somewhere between the 4th to 10th centuries AD. But again, there was a rich oral tradition, certainly. And so that is explicitly it comments about forced miscarriage, not early delivery. So here's what is happening in the broad Jewish community. The Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic texts are being used simultaneously. That winds up being possible and not in conflict, because the phrase an eye for an eye was about an upper limit of compensation anyway, in terms of a fine. And so it can all work together. Now, if you take the early delivery view, though, then you are imposing a kind of schizophrenia on the Jewish community, because you have to ask, could the manuscripts and understandings have worked together functionally? They could have only if the fetus is assigned full human personhood, not at conception, but at some later point, either at, when it's fully formed in the womb or when it's born, and there's a fine that represents that, but not really if the fetus was meant to be treated with full human personhood from conception. Reason number 4 for the forced miscarriage view. The word smite, as in smite a woman with child, always means that someone dies. The Hebrew word behind that is negaf, and every time it's used, it means a death-dealing blow, both in the intent and the effect, every single time, in the Pentateuch and actually in every other Old Testament book. So that's really important. If you compare that with the Hebrew word nakah, where both the intent and the impact are uncertain, then you have a different understanding of the severity of this word negaf. Even more important is that nakah is used in Exodus 21 when the intent and impact are both uncertain and people have to do some more investigative work, right? Like the community has to discern something, as opposed to negaf, which is a death-dealing blow. And so in this case, in the case of a pregnant woman getting struck, someone intended to cause the miscarriage, apparently, and it succeeded. And so someone who died, the fetus, but not the mother. So on the strength of this word, it cannot mean early delivery. Reason number 5, you take the literary context of Exodus 21, all of these things are dealing with bodily harm. From a literary or storytelling standpoint, it makes sense because God had just delivered Israel out of Egypt, where they had suffered massive bodily harm. And so, of course, there's going to be protections put in place for bodily harm. And early delivery, it is certainly inconvenient, but if the baby is healthy, it's hard to argue that that's bodily harm. I mean, biologically speaking, that often happens. Forced miscarriage, though, is definitely bodily harm. Furthermore, all of Exodus 21 is a chiasm. It's a particular literary structure where the first point matches the last point, the second point matches the second to last point, and so on. And so there's this symmetry between them. So when we look at C and C prime, there's definitely asymmetry. There's a fight, someone is harmed, and then there's compensation imposed on the assailant for that harm. And so a miscarriage fits that situation. Early delivery does not. Furthermore, from D to A prime, you have lasting bodily harm, which is different from the temporary bodily harm from before. And so again, miscarriage fits, early delivery does not. Reason number 7, the fetus is treated as part of the woman's body elsewhere in Scripture. So for example, if there's a woman who commits adultery under Jewish law, now it depends on how much evidence there is for that. There is the jealous husband situation who suspects her of having committed adultery. Maybe she's pregnant and maybe she's not. But in any case, there is a test that is given in Numbers chapter 5. And the consequence, if she is guilty of adultery, is her belly becomes bloated. Presumably, if she was pregnant, that would cause an abortion. But in any case, if not, she cannot bear child again. If there is sufficient evidence to convict her of adultery, then especially if the adulterous man involved is also found out, then both of them are put to death and the fetus dies with her. Jewish law does not ask the question, well, if she's pregnant, maybe we should wait to see. No, the penalty is immediate and the fetus would die with her. Reason number 8 for why the forced miscarriage view. Well, Adam is used as an archetype. So the idea that God first makes Adam's body and then breathes life, or the soul, nephesh in Hebrew, into him is kind of taken as an archetype. So full human personhood is marked by birth and breath in the story of Genesis 2. Also in the case of Eve, because Eve is fashioned from the side or rib of Adam. And I don't think God would make Eve endure the formation of her own body. I think the inference is that the same thing happened. Right? He takes Eve, forms Eve's body from existing human DNA, human material, and then breathes into her breath and life. And so in English, we get this sensibility when we say things like take your first breath and take your last breath. In fact, the Hebrew word havvah, which is breath, also means existence. And so that is fascinating. It's built into the Hebrew language itself. You could see more of my notes on the Anástasis Center website, because that's a fascinating point, very important point. That's the intuition of the Hebrew Masoretic text of Exodus 21. Even King David in Psalm 139, 13 through 16, distinguishes between unformed and formed stages in the womb. So he speaks of my unformed substance, and then you formed my inward parts. You wove me together in my mother's womb. So that's going to be understood by later Christians in a particular way. I'll get there in just a minute. Here's reason number 9 of 9. There's a biblical pattern that God makes the habitation and then gives the life. So that's true in creation, where God makes the planet as a habitat, almost like a temple, and then puts his image bearers in the creation as the life, as the image bearers. There's the human body, and then the soul, the nephesh, the breath of life for Adam and for Eve. There's the tabernacle, which gets built, and later the temple. But in both cases, the idea is God has the building built and then puts his Shekinah glory, the pillar of light and fire, into the holiest of places there. And then human beings who are followers of Jesus, Jesus calls together a community and then invests them with his spirit, the Spirit of God. There's a lot of passages if you want to chase down those references, but the basic idea is that there's a pattern. God makes the habitation, then invests the life. It's worth recognizing that the modern state of Israel kind of represents the majority Jewish tradition on the fetus and abortion. And so in the state of Israel, abortion is legal for women ages 18 and under and women over the age of 40. The abortion is also legal for some of the classic exceptions, including the more generous view of things. So it's legal for rape, statutory rape, incest, birth defects, risk to the mother's life, and risk to the mother's health. Abortion is also funded by their national health plan. So all of the citizens of the state of Israel are covered by the national health plan, and abortion is fully funded for women 19 and younger, and also for birth defects. It's partially funded if a woman says, I conceived out of wedlock. Apparently you have to pay for half the procedure, but the national health plan pays for the rest. Shows that the Jewish tradition thinks about passages like Numbers chapter 5 and Deuteronomy 22, the moral relational context of the fetus. And then it's administered by an abortion committee. You have to go before 3 people, one of whom must be a woman. That is also, something similar happens in the Jewish community in the US. For example, in Florida, there is a synagogue, and maybe by now a group of synagogues arguing for their abortion rights under the principle of religious freedom, based on the Hebrew Masoretic understanding of Exodus 21. That's pretty significant. So to sum up, why does the fetus not have full legal personhood in Exodus 21? Well, number one, comparison to other ancient Near East law codes demonstrates what is going on there. Number two, consideration for accidental manslaughter is not used here, which means that the premise that the fetus is assigned full human person is not true. Number three, the paper trail, the history of Jewish discussion about this indicates they did not regard the fetus as having full human personhood from conception. Number four, word selection. The Hebrew word nagaf means smite or death-dealing blow. Number five, the literary context indicates bodily harm. Number six, again, the literary context indicates permanent bodily harm. Early delivery is not bodily harm. Miscarriage fits much better. Number seven, the fetus, whether potential or actual, is treated as part of the woman's body elsewhere in Scripture. And number eight, Adam and Eve serve as archetypes in the sense that God makes the body first and then invests the soul. And then number nine, there's a biblical pattern. God makes the physical structure first and then the life. Now, this totally impacted the early Christians. Early Christians recognized that they had two different manuscripts of Exodus 21, and so they went in different directions. in terms of how they viewed the fetus and the act of abortion. Broadly speaking, I'm going to group the early Christians into Greek, Latin, and then Syriac Greek speakers. So 3 major traditions in the early church. By the 4th century, they had a friendly disagreement where they recognized, okay, we don't know which manuscript to major on. And even if we did, we need a bit more information. And so they looked to Greek science and medicine, but they didn't agree which one. And this is deeply relevant because it impacts our legal history in the United States. It also role models seeing science as a friend, not as a foe, which is why I'll spend 10 minutes later talking about science. So let me try to summarize these things. So in the Greek East, which is centered in Asia Minor and Greece, the city of Constantinople, they chose to not allow abortions for Christians. They are originally pragmatic about this. Why is that? Well, it's because many Greek-speaking bishops, like Basil of Caesarea, were educated and even trained as physicians. So Basil of Caesarea had like 7 graduate degrees. He took the Hippocratic Oath, so he was a doctor. They drew on Hippocrates and Galen on the fetus. Now, the Greek doctors had a tradition of believing in pre-formation. In other words, they believed that the fetus was already formed in the father's sperm and that the whole fetus was contained in the father's sperm. The mother only provided the nourishment and the incubation. So if you believe that, then of course, you would view any interruption of delivering the sperm into the mother's womb as tantamount to murder, or at least you're agnostic and not sure, so you're going to err on the side of safety. Now, what this means is that Basil and the other Orthodox leaders used the Greek Septuagint translation, but went beyond it. Remember, the Greek Septuagint said, okay, look at whether the fetus is unformed or formed. They go beyond it. And so as a result, the Orthodox Study Bible uses the Greek Septuagint, but has no notes on verse 22. So I took a picture there of the Study Bible there. It's remarkable that it would say one thing, but then the tradition says another. The Latin West, meaning Rome and North Africa and the region into what is today France and Spain, takes a different view. So in this tradition says that abortion was permitted before ensoulment, or the point of quickening. That was the moment when mom felt the baby kick. Usually it's about halfway through the pregnancy. And so they're a little complicated. They actually use the Greek Septuagint. Later, because of Jerome's translation of the Hebrew directly into Latin, what's called the Vulgate translation, which takes the forced miscarriage view, they said, all right, we're going to go with the more conservative one, the Greek Septuagint. And they drew on Aristotle, because Aristotle was the Greek scientist who studied miscarriages. He said that he thought male fetuses were formed at 40 days of gestation and female fetuses were formed at 90 days of gestation. Don't ask me why he thought that. I'm not sure why, but eventually church tradition just landed on 90 days. And so here are some quotes that are good examples. Augustine of Hippo, probably the most influential of the Latin writers, says this: one who procures an abortion before the soul is infused into the body is not a murderer. An embryo which is not yet formed cannot be murdered, nor can it properly be considered a human being in the womb. This depends on the soul, for when something is unformed and has no soul, it cannot be murdered. Here's Anselm of Canterbury in around 1100. No human intellect accepts the view that an infant has the rational soul from the moment of conception. And Roman Catholic canon law distinguished between a fetus animatus and a fetus inanimatus until 1869. We'll talk about what happened in that year and thereabouts. But this is the Latin West. the third tradition is the Syriac Greek. They were bilingual. They were centered around Antioch in modern-day Syria and stretched into Mesopotamia. To some degree, this tradition, the Syriac Greek East, is represented by the Didache. It's an early document which said, and even late first century, that said, do not abort a child. Right around the time of the Dobbs decision, I saw a lot of memes or graphics that were circulating in social media, which quoted it: you shall not murder a child by abortion nor kill that which is born. So abortion and infanticide are definitely linked in early Christian thought, and both are considered to be sins. But the Didache itself needed clarification. What is a child? There's another document called the Apostolic Constitutions. It was written sometime in the late 4th century, and it is really fascinating. It looks at the Didache as scripture. It thinks it is New Testament scripture. And yet it agrees with the Greek Septuagint translation of Exodus 21, meaning the fetus is either unformed or formed, and uses that to interpret the Didache. And so according to this Syriac Greek document, the Didache was not forbidding early abortion. It was an agreement with the Greek Septuagint. And then in general, the Syriac tradition is a little messy, maybe because the influence of Islam made it difficult to coordinate and standardize, but in any case, you have different views. At the Persian uses the view of birth and breath from the Hebrew Masoretic. Then there's definitely some who take the stage of the fetus, like Apostolic Constitutions. You can also consider the liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which says really interesting stuff. I'll just read a little portion. O you who takes a child from his father's waist to the woman's womb. Notice there the pre-formationist view, right? The father's sperm contains the full human being. The woman's womb only, the mother only contributes incubation. Who clots him after he is formed as fluid, you breathe out the breath of life into him on the 40th day in the womb. What is that doing there? Well, lots of thoughts. Again, you can look at some of my notes on the web for that. But what that means is there was a combination of the Hebrew view of breathing into, the fetus, breathing and life or ensoulment, and the Greek pre-formationist view. So anyway, in any case, that fits under the stage of the fetus, right? And then the third view is there's a question mark of full fetal personhood from the Syriac translation called the Peshitta, which was a Christian development, not Jewish one. It seems to hold to the early delivery view, but more work needs to be done on that. And what's interesting is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church uses the Peshitta as their Old Testament, but still had this, breathe into the fetus life or the soul at 40 days. So that would need to be compared with other Syriac translations, and I'm chasing that down now. John Calvin was the first person to really argue strongly for fetal personhood from conception. And notice how he argues. This is from his commentary. For the fetus, though enclosed in the womb of its mother, is already a human being, and it is almost a monstrous crime. Notice he cushions his language. To rob it of the life which it has not yet begun to enjoy. If it seems more horrible to kill a man in his own house than in a field, because a man's house is his place of most secure refuge, it ought surely to be deemed more atrocious to destroy a fetus in the womb before it has come to light. On these grounds, I'm led to conclude and ... So that is his reasoning. Notice how he reasons. He says is already. So he assumes the fetus already has personhood. And then he creates this distinction about the location of, a murder of an adult or manslaughter, field versus house distinction, which is not meaningful because place does not indicate premeditation or passion. If you want to read John Piper's defense of the full fetal personhood view, you can. Here's the link there. please do read my response to that. And here the implications for the United States involve our legal history, because again, this is about the law and the development of law. So in the quickening view is present in the Catholic West, which is inherited by the Anglican and the Puritan churches, including the Puritans who settled North America and the English Christians there. And so the quickening view was present at the time of the US Constitution and for decades more. So right away, we have to say Justice Alito's claim that abortion is, quote, not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition is wrong. He said that in Dobbs, but he's being very selective about his history. In fact, in the US, the South maintained quickening far longer than the North and the West for very peculiar reasons, which I get into in the book. This also touches on science and what is the Christian relationship to science? So early Christians thought science was a friend. Western Christians from the late 1800s on believed that science was a foe, and they begin to use abortion as an issue, as a wedge issue there. And we'll get into that in just a minute. So I want to summarize the material on Scripture. This is why Exodus 21 verses 22 to 25 does not assign full human personhood to the fetus. I gave 9 reasons for it. We also touch on the Jewish understanding of Exodus 21. There's 2 major manuscripts and there are commentaries on them. Neither one reflect the idea that conception equals personhood. The main difference is breath versus body. So the Hebrew Masoretic takes breath and birth to be the start of personhood. The Greek Septuagint takes body, or the stage of fetal formation, being formed enough to be recognizable as a human body, as personhood. Early Christians engaged in the Latin West and the Greek East recognized, and the Syriac tradition too, recognized that there are both biblical manuscripts, and they use 2 main scientific views. Greek medicine and Greek science. So Hippocrates versus Aristotle. And the implications for US legal history is that even if you take an originalist view of the US Constitution, you would still arrive at the view that some early abortion was permitted. So at this point, I want to let you discuss. Here are some questions that I thought would be meaningful. You could, of course, discuss other things, including pushback or other questions related to Scripture. Number 1, if the Bible does not make the fetus a full human person from conception, how would you be affected? Number 2, with whom would you want to discuss Exodus 21 or share this presentation? Right. You may be thinking of someone who you would like to engage with this. And number 3, given that the modern day state of Israel allows abortion, would you give Jews in the US similar abortion rights on account of freedom of religion in the First Amendment? Why or why not? So I will let you either discuss that or think about this if you are chewing on this privately. And in just a moment, I'll come back and complete the presentation. You may hit pause on this recording, and I'll see you on the other side of the discussion. Let me resume session 1 by talking about science for about 10 minutes and then giving you some time to discuss. As I mentioned in the first part of the presentation, human personhood is difficult to determine because there are 2 manuscripts. They don't exactly agree. And so the early Christians looked at science to help them read Scripture. So the Hebrew and the Greek manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts talk about having a fine for miscarriage. The Greek manuscript talks about discern formation or not formation, and then discuss the consequence. And the Catholic Church pre-1869 held to the quickening view, which was halfway through the pregnancy when mom felt the baby kick. That was the moment God ensouled the fetus, and that's when the fetus became a full human person. What happened in 1869? That is important. So the Catholic Church basically decides it's better to be safe than sorry. we were learning more scientifically about the fetus at about this time. And so this is what the New Catholic Encyclopedia says about this shift away from Aristotle to conception. After a certain stage of intrauterine development, it is perfectly evident that fetal life is fully human. Although some might speculate as to when that stage is reached, there is no way of arriving at this knowledge by any known criterion. And as long as it is probable that embryonic life is human from the first moment of its existence, the purposeful termination is immoral. Now, the context of the late 1800s is really important. Why was science seen as hostile? Well, Darwin's theory of evolution was one reason, but also there was what's called higher criticism or deconstruction of Scripture. The idea that that scholars could look at Scripture and see sources of the Scripture from like human sources, and the canon of Scripture was a political move, like a compromise, similar to the US Constitution, right, between free states and slave states. So that was threatening to the church in that sense. And also mass contraception started to become available, condoms. Also cars were starting to become available, and that was seen as a place where young people were having sex. So why would personhood at conception and papal infallibility protect the church against science? In 1869 and 1870, you really do have to take these two things together. In 1870, Vatican I was convened, and that's when the Catholic Church declared that the Pope, when he sits on the chair, is never wrong. These two things are evidence that the Catholic Church was concerned about science, because saying that the fetus was a person at conception put the moral relevance of the church beyond science. Well, you can't prove that the fetus is not, should not be treated as a fully human person. And so we're always going to be relevant. And by the way, the next year we declare that our source of authority is infallible. The Protestants had a variation on this. In 1902, they declared the doctrine of biblical infallibility. The fundamentalists, or so-called fundamentalists, declared that in the face of debates with science. And in 2012, just to pick one data point, there was a congressional representative, Paul Brown from Georgia, who said at a fundraiser in a church, he said the Big Bang, the long ages of the universe and the earth, the theory of evolution, and embryology, and I underscore that, embryology are, quote, lies straight from the pit of hell. So that's the context. Science was seen as a foe, but we have to now consider science as a friend. What if we did that? Again, the early Christians, they use science as an ally in this, because they realized they need some help. So here are some considerations from the field of embryology. Based on IVF studies, intravenous fertilization studies, between 50 to 70% of all fertilized eggs do not implant in the uterus. That's pretty surprising, because from a spiritual point of view, we would have to ask, why would God ensoul the embryo only to lose 50 to 70% of all people for no reason at all? Now, there are some Christians who are prepared to say, yeah, I guess in eternity, there's just going to be a lot more people that we never knew existed. I suppose that's possible, but that raises questions about consistency between, what God does and what God says. So compare your own reaction to failure rates of a general who sends soldiers into battle and loses 50 to 70% of all people, soldiers for no particular reason. Or, a general contractor who hires workers to build a project like a building, or NASA chief who sends astronauts into space. Anyone who sends people into a situation and loses 50 to 70% of all the personnel, that's for no reason. That's really difficult. So it raises the consistency issue. Secondly, chimerism and to some degree twinning raise a problem for Christian theology. So what is the problem here? Well, let's start with the facts. Twins, fraternal twins, can recombine to form one body probably a few days after twinning. How often does twinning happen? Well, monozygotic twinning occurs 8 to 10 days after fertilization in 3 to 5 cases for every 1,000 pregnancies. There's the other form of twinning where 2 eggs are fertilized at once, but in this case, chimerism is where those embryos seem to combine. And there are studies that suggest that chimerism is far more widespread than we have thought. Sometimes it shows up, for example, when people have different colored eyes, like in this graphic. At other times, it shows up in blood chimerism or organ chimerism, or when you have a child and that child has the suppressed DNA of your dead twin, or a twin that you're carrying in your own body, and it's not your, quote unquote, your presenting DNA. So it's really interesting. Catholic and Protestant theology is faced with a problem that Carol Tower, who's a Catholic bioethicist, wrote about in 1984. And basically she says, better safe than sorry doesn't work here. The phenomenon of twinning, and especially that of recombination, offers strong positive evidence that the human soul is not yet present in the early embryo. For in the traditional Catholic understanding, the soul is indivisible and indestructible, and souls cannot split, fuse, or disappear. The soul is the principle of selfhood, which, like it, is a unique and indivisible marker. So, in 1869, the reasoning was given, it's called the moral probability theory. What Carol Tower is saying here is now we have to speak of it as a moral improbability that ensoulment happens at conception. Another factor from science is cell potency. Cell potency is the phenomenon that over time fetal cells specialize and lose their potential as they specialize. So from conception to the 4-day marker, there is one zygote that becomes what we now call totipotent cells. The totipotent cells can become the embryo, or more than one embryo, because it can twin, or one of them can twin. But one of those totipotent cells knows to become the placenta. The issue here is that totipotent cells are identical. So the problem with placing ensoulment and personhood before day 4 is that you would have to answer the following questions, right? Can the placenta have a soul or part of a soul? I mean, usually we would say, no, that's impossible. So can ensoulment happen before totipotent cells commit to being either an embryo or embryos or a placenta? Well, probably not. Furthermore, from days 4 through 21, the totipotent cells become pluripotent cells, which can become the entire embryo or a specific organ. This is the fascinating thing about stem cell research. Pluripotent cells develop further based on their biological context. They read the electrical charges of where they're located. And so either they recognize they're in the womb and generally then become an organ, or they recognize they've been placed in an organ, in a particular organ. For example, animal studies have shown that you can do that. And the interesting thing is that pluripotent cells can be coaxed back into an earlier stage of development. So the problems with saying ensoulment and personhood can happen before day 21 are as follows. Can a soul be trapped in a liver, right? Because you could allow pluripotent cells to become the embryo, but then reverse them and then place them in a liver. So can ensoulment happen before pluripotent cells are committed? I would say no. So it is impossible and cannot be substantiated, the view that personhood happens at conception. Both theological and magisterial opinion up until the 19th century were open to the view that the ensoulment of the early embryo is highly improbable, if not impossible. The reasoning of the congregation in forbidding all abortions, including the destruction of zygotes, is linked to the stringency of the moral tradition regarding factual doubts in relation to human life. But the thesis that ensoulment is a matter of fact within this context cannot be substantiated. That is Carol Tower, saying, again, the moral probability argument now has to be phrased as a moral improbability argument. And so the earliest possible estimates for human personhood or ensoulment really should be coordinated between the end of life and the beginning of life. Why is that? Well, just for consistency's sake. I mean, at the end of life, let's say I lose a hand. There still is no question, legally, socially, functionally, that I'm a human person. The issue here, but if I lose my brain or brain activity or a nervous system, there would be a question. What would I be in that case? Now, there's a whole lot of other discussion about that, but I'm just saying there is a minimum of functioning nervous system and brain activity tend to be a bare minimum for personhood at the end of life. So what if we take that as a minimum at the beginning of life, to do beginning of life care? Well, then there are two markers. At the 23-day marker of embryonic life, the nervous system is formed, and sometime between 40 to 43 days, we are able to detect brain waves in the fetus. After those thresholds, like the 23 or 43-day thresholds, we know the following: twins will not recombine. Cell potency issues are resolved. The embryos are already implanted in the uterus. Now, we're still not saying how to weigh competing moral claims, like what happens if the mother's life is endangered. But at the very least, this means that the earliest that we could be saying ensoulment or personhood is traceable is probably between this 23 to 43-day marker and probably the 43-day marker. Practically speaking, this means that folks can be open to all forms of contraception. Contraception is important because it's the single most effective way to bring down the rates of unintended pregnancy and abortion. The Affordable Care Act, passed and implemented in 2010, reduced abortion rates because it provided contraceptive care to women. And especially poor women benefited because contraception is expensive. Especially, there are studies with IUDs or intrauterine devices, which are long-acting contraception, which have shown to be especially effective at reducing unintended pregnancy and abortion. The key here is that it can be expanded. The difficulty that conservatives have had with these forms of contraception, IUDs, or even the RU486 or the morning after pill, is the belief that they can cause an abortion. In other words, maybe it allows for an egg to be fertilized, but then it prevents that fertilized egg from implanting in the uterus, and that would count as an abortion. But that would happen well within the window of time, even of the 23-day mark, definitely of the 43-day mark. And so they have opposed contraception care or expanding the Medicaid portion of the Affordable Care Act into certain states, which results in worse maternal health outcomes. And so the issue here is that the most conservative I think that we can be as Christians is to say, really, 43 days is the earliest we can say personhood begins. And so we can be open to contraception in all forms with a clear conscience. So again, as a summary, what did we cover here? Well, we covered scripture and science. In scripture, Exodus 21 does not assign full human personhood to the fetus from conception. We looked at how the early Christians handled that because there were different manuscripts. They deployed ancient science, which later became kind of somewhat rigid traditions. And the impact on Western Christianity and US history is that abortion until quickening was legally and socially accepted long after the US Constitution. And abortion is often used to protect Christian faith from science, but this is the wrong attitude. So Here's some discussion questions I thought would be meaningful. Number one, have you seen Christians use the Bible? And I put that in quotes because it's not exactly the Bible that they're using here, but they claim they're using the Bible to ignore science, especially in the area of fetal development. If so, how have you seen that? Number two, what do you think about the argument that God probably doesn't ensoul the fetus until 23 days at the earliest, and likely at 40 to 43 days with a detectable brainwaves? What questions, if any, do you have? Number three, do you support contraception to reduce unwanted pregnancies? What can you do to ensure that contraceptives are legally protected, free or low cost, and available? I'll let you discuss. And that brings session 1 to a close. Thanks, friends, and I'll see you in session 2.